The next company was located another 150 to 200 metres farther on in the wood line, which extended between the railway embankment and the roll barn. This guard therefore had to cover the longest stretch. We then went to the man at the right contact point of the next battalion, which belonged to the Feldherrnhalle division. There, in the woods, a proper front line started. It ran along to the railway embankment heading east. The Russians had established their lines in another wood line 200 metres to the south. No foot soldier enjoyed having completely open terrain to his back. It doesn't offer any cover and makes it practically impossible in a difficult situation to bring up reserves without the enemy being able to observe and disturb every movement. Our infantry found itself in just such a complicated situation in these positions. That made the necessity of our presence all the more obvious. If the Russians were to get the dumb idea to attack farther to the north, then our comrades could not have prevented a penetration without armour support. Our infantry was busily engaged in building up the strong points into bunkers. The basements were reinforced with beams, firing ports were added, and the duty stoker ensured that the guards could always warm up. Compared to them, those of us in the tanks were quite bad off in the winter whenever we had to pull security for days and weeks on end, as we did there. We would have been happy to have a little bit of the heat that prevailed in the tanks in the summer. In the winter, it was like sitting in an icebox. To warm us up a little bit once in a while, we had come up with the idea of burning a large petroleum lamp. While we were in training, it had been strictly forbidden to smoke in the tank. And there we were, allowing a petroleum lamp to burn at full throttle in front of the enemy. Thank God that an accident never occurred in any of the tanks of the company because of this carelessness. But there were other effects. For example, whenever all of us had dozed off and the pressure on the wick let up some, it began to smoke like there was no tomorrow. We all looked like chimney sweeps. Because of the soot, the inside of all of our tanks could scarcely be called white anymore. The air wasn't the best either. I am amazed today that none of us was poisoned from smoke inhalation. A standard phrase applied back then. Nobody has ever died from the stink, but a lot have from freezing. Even the rations in the tank tasted of gas or oil. With time and in a pinch, however, people get used to everything. This smell of gas and old oil, this tank smell, even became quite agreeable to us over the years. In the grey of morning, a young soldier came running to my vehicle. He reported that his people in the nearest strongpoint had observed the Russians emplacing the first AT gun in the railway embankment. Of course, I promised immediate countermeasures. An old truth. We had to show something to our infantry comrades to win their trust. If that was done, we could talk to them in a reasonable manner and not have to worry about dumb things happening. Then both of us boldly drove out to the second strongpoint and lined up against the railway embankment. The Russian anti-tank gun was difficult to identify because it had been camouflaged magnificently. Only the muzzle brake peeked out. Because Ivan still hadn't fired up to then, he missed his chance. After a few rounds, the barrel of the gun pointed skyward, looking like it could have been that of an anti-aircraft weapon. Even though we were scarcely 50 metres in front of the thing, it could not be finished off with a single round. Ivan had emplaced it very skillfully in the railway embankment. We first had to soften up the exterior. During this minor operation, I could finally take a look at the terrain during the day. Without a doubt, the Russians had the advantage over us. Behind the railway embankment were a few rows of high fir trees. The Russians were later able to dominate the entire terrain using sharpshooters from the peaks. Behind that, visible through the fir trees, was an open plain, which extended to the edge of a fairly tall set of woods in a marsh. The row of trees stopped at the railway crossing. The Russians had therefore let their front line move back at that point, because the embankment became lower to the east and didn't offer enough cover. After our little morning excursion, we drove back to the farmhouse. At that time, we had no idea that we would have to continue this monotonous existence of pulling security for weeks on end. We had scarcely arrived into position behind the farmhouse when a VW Keeble came racing down the road from the Kinderheim. Ivan could see this route without any problems, and immediately began to pepper us with mortar rounds. Fortunately, he didn't hit the Keeble. Old man Bierman, a career non-commissioned officer, climbed out of it. He ran the forward supply point and wouldn't hear of not bringing us rations, even in the most impossible of situations. He drove right up to us, and we were able to take our meal. I greeted him with a few choice words. "You put your life on the line for this lumpy chow. Have you gone crazy?" Bierman gave a short reply. "Don't forget, I also want my warm food and my coffee. But if you didn't have anything here up front, then how are we supposed to enjoy our meal?" That wasn't just dumb talk or idle bragging. His words came from the heart. Whenever there are shots fired in anger, all the idle bragging stops. It was that selfless comradeship and altruistic commitment that will never let us forget the difficult times at the front. It holds us together even today. Only when everyone has to show his true colours and substance counts, not a uniform or an external mask, does one really get to know a person. One can be sure that these comrades won't let one down in peacetime either. Granted, a war isn't exactly necessary in order to really know a person. But the experience of comradeship, this bonding to the others without regard for oneself, has convinced me that our time in the war had not been lost. Instead, it has given all of us something to take with us on the path of life. In my experience, the people who curse a blue streak about their army time and talk about stolen years were usually poor comrades and boundless egoists. Of course, Old Man Bierman was only old for us young bucks. He was probably in his mid-30s. He had a family and had been a member of the Social Democrats, a party that he still admitted belonging to. He never attempted to conceal his opinions, but that didn't stop his becoming a non-commissioned officer. He was a tremendous soldier. None of us ever asked to see someone's party membership book. No one, except for the first sergeant who kept the company rolls, knew who belonged to what religion. Who cared whether someone was from Saxony or from the Pfalz, from Berlin or from Austria? What counted was that he did his duty in the group and that we could depend on him. To the enemy, everyone was the same. The Russians didn't differentiate. On the other hand, whoever let us down at the front and couldn't get his act together was written off by his fellow soldiers. He had a hard time being accepted back into the community. It was with Bierman that I liked to talk about our options after the war. We occasionally had the thought that we could lose it. We all had our fantasies. Life after the war would be so nice if everyone respected everyone else as we did in the company, without regard to party, religion, and occupation. The main thing was that everyone did his job the best way he could. We believed back then that such ideals could be realized in a democracy. But doubts also surfaced as to whether such ideal relationships could be created in the world at all. We later had to experience just how justified these doubts were. Old Man Bierman liked to say, "The guy who sits at the feed trough gets to pig out, and if he is the only one who is pigging out, then everybody else can still be satisfied." He may well have hit the nail on the head with that. Following my little digression, let's return to the front at Narwa. Ivan continued to remain suspiciously quiet. Only when we allowed our engines to warm up for a quarter of an hour did he start to pepper us. He was probably assuming that we wanted to take off and stir up some trouble where he was. As soon as we heard the barn of the firing, we quickly buttoned our hatches. A few seconds later, the mortar rounds were hitting in our vicinity. Because the fuses were very sensitive, they made any type of penetration into the frozen earth impossible. The rounds only left black marks in the snow after impacting. Later on, with the 15-centimeter mortars, things became a whole lot more uncomfortable. The days passed by with dozing and freezing. In a comfortable civilian life, people have a hard time imagining how we could get used to the continuous cold. Despite it, we stripped off our old clothes twice a day to delouse ourselves. How thankful we would have been for a can of DDT powder. We hardly changed our underwear. Experience had taught us that our friendly rear-end roomers felt better in clean laundry. Therefore, the underwear had to be so dirty that even the lice were disgusted. Only then was their urge to reproduce somewhat dampened. Back then, I possessed 3 utensils that reminded me of my distant civilian life. First, there was a nail cleaner, highly valued by all of us. Then there was a comb, which also performed yeoman service. Finally, there was an old hairpin, which I used to clean my ears. It also circulated among the other comrades, and I was able to hold on to it throughout the war and prison camp. The subject of water was a sore one. Washing and even shaving were not high on the list of priorities. Naturally, the few wells had become frozen. The infantrymen didn't have it any better than we did either. But foot soldiers know how to take care of themselves, even in the craziest of situations. Whenever meatballs arrived with the rations at night, we ate them with our hands. Our skin became visible under the soot and the dirt again. These things were of secondary importance to us anyway. We were all happy whenever we could sleep in a stretched-out position for at least a few hours during the night. We drove back to the western outskirts of the village on the second night. In one house, we found a bunker constructed under the floor. Even if we didn't have a stove in there, we could at least sleep in a stretched-out position in our winter clothing. Due to our exhaustion, we didn't notice the cold at all. The truck with the fuel, ammunition and rations came at midnight. For the first time, we ate with a real appetite. During the day, we only forced something down reluctantly. Often I wouldn't have eaten at all if my crew hadn't forced me to. The men simply did not let me light up a cigarette until I had finished my bread. My gunner, Unteroffizier Heinz Kramer, was extremely hard and unrelenting in this regard. It should be noted that we were extremely well fed, given the circumstances. Our mess sergeant, Unteroffizier Seidel, a barber by trade and from Vienna, spared no effort, even though he would have preferred to be in a tank again. He often provided us with dumplings and vegetables and avoided stews as much as possible. The men who brought rations, fuel and munitions up front deserve special praise. They had a difficult and responsible mission. These resourceful men had to find us right behind the front and arrive in one piece. They always travelled at night, without lights, and usually on unfamiliar routes, which were disrupted daily by new craters. Their mission was often more difficult than ours at the front. At least we were familiar with the local situation. They almost always had to count upon surprises. They were then expected to do the right thing based on their own initiative. Despite all that, we were never left without resupply. We were quite happy with our new night camp. The men in the lines could also be reassured. We had laid a field phone line from them to us. Shortly before daybreak, we would drive back to the farmhouse. There, someone usually came running to us to report what new things Ivan had done the previous night at the railway embankment. Occasionally, there were also some humorous episodes. Once in a while, we shot off the crowns of the trees on the other side of the railway embankment because they appeared suspicious. Ivan had sharpshooters in them. They breathed down our necks and prevented any type of free movement. During one such incident, a young infantryman, who clearly hadn't been at the front very long, came running out of breath to my tank. He excitedly explained that the Russians had posted armoured sharpshooters in the trees. He had observed exactly how our machine gun ammo had bounced off them. He thought I really ought to be shooting in the trees with main gun rounds. And what had the well-meaning youth actually seen? The tracers of our rounds flew in all directions after contact with a branch. At the same time, however, the trajectory of the machine gun rounds was naturally quite different. Our comrade departed reassured. It should be noted, however, that he had only been a bit premature with the facts. Later, after penetrating the east sack, we were actually able to find body armour. It was worn primarily by the commissars and offered very nice protection against shrapnel and pistol rounds. In my opinion, though, this armour must have seriously impeded movement. My men had to get used to a lot of things, and did it without complaining. There was one requirement, however, that they only begrudgingly got used to and complained about a lot. No one was allowed to relieve themselves during an operation or while pulling security. Personal relief had been ordered for the mornings and the evenings. If necessary, there was no other choice but to take care of business in the tank. With the passage of time, everyone got used to this rule, and there weren't any more problems. There was a reason for this harsh action. The majority of the men were lost when they were outside the tank. The Russians, who could observe their dismounting, immediately fired with rifles or mortars. Besides the senseless wounding of the men, there was the additional problem of getting equally good replacements from the home front. Because of my strict orders, we actually only had 2 more casualties outside of a tank, and these were with another Einsatzgruppe. Of course, as tank commanders, we had to get out once in a while to go to the infantry. The men didn't like that either. Whenever I wanted to climb out of the turret, Kramer often held me by the legs. He was afraid I might catch a round. On February 27th, bomber units paid their respects for the first time. From then on, these nuisances came every night, sometimes even twice in a night. They apparently wanted to prepare our positions for an assault. Shortly before the onset of darkness, the Pathfinder flew in from the south and dropped the familiar Christmas trees behind our lines. Immediately after that, 2-engine bombers appeared. They dropped their loads behind us on both sides of the roll barn. For the duration of the attack, Ivan fired red and pink flares toward us. They helped to orient the pilots so that they didn't drop bombs on their own lines. In addition, the Russians had stacked piles of wood behind the front line. These had the shape of a Soviet star and were ignited at the onset of darkness. Despite all of this, they sometimes dropped too short. In general, we didn't have anything to worry about right behind the front. In the following weeks, the Russians transformed the entire area on both sides of the roll barn, from Narwa to us, into a moonscape. Because of the marshy land, the bombs burrowed deep into the earth before they blew up. They then scooped out high walls of earth. There were craters the size of single-family houses. They immediately filled up with water. We were well advised to take a close look at the terrain in the morning so we didn't drive into them in case of action. What could happen will be reported in another section. Our flak only took the Pathfinder under fire, because then the ammunition was gone. Unfortunately, they didn't always succeed in hitting it. Even though we felt safe to a certain extent, this whole business still didn't give us a warm and cozy feeling. Whenever those guys dropped their bombs, we had the feeling that they were rushing straight at us. This feeling lasted until they finally landed at a safe distance and made the soft earth tremble. In the tank, we thought we were standing on a spring mattress. Of course, we quickly set up our countermeasures. Whenever we saw the Pathfinder approach over the bridgehead in the evening, it was dubbed the duty NCO because of its punctuality. We quickly moved back to our house in Lembitu. We did that so we weren't moving whenever the Christmas tree appeared in the heavens. This short move out of the danger zone wasn't a retreat. We drove toward the west and parallel to the front. We were then located in front of the so-called boot shaft. That is, we had Ivan right beside us. It was impossible for the bombers to hit us in the narrow boot. On the same evening, after our guests from the air had left us again, the division surgeon came to us riding in the resupply vehicle. He wanted to check out the health and welfare of the troops. No one was sick, but all of us had such swollen feet and legs that a few men had already cut open their boots somewhat to get relief. We couldn't take the things off since no one would have gotten them on again. It was at that point that the Honourable Division Surgeon appeared and examined our legs. He caused a laugh riot when he, in all seriousness, proposed that we should take foot baths in the evenings. We didn't even have water to wash our faces or a place to light a fire. It only would have betrayed us to the Russians. 2 of my people absolutely had to be sent to the rear, he said, because their feet were especially bad. But nothing could convince them to ride to the rear and be relieved. That was the spirit of our frontline comrades. Only the defective fantasy of a third-rate hack could dream up the fairy tale that a pistol had sometimes been necessary to force our subordinates into combat. Ivan had given it another try with an anti-tank gun. According to the infantry, he had also built a bunker in the embankment at the railway crossing. He didn't let himself be distracted by our direct hits. Every evening he built something new, just like a mole. Without a doubt, the Russians were superior to us in the building of field fortifications. Equal parts natural talent and hard drill were responsible for that. They always dug in before we identified them. It should also be noted that the Russian anti-tank guns didn't engage in a duel with us. The crew usually scrammed before we got into a good position. A few days later, a report reached us from Corps that a Russian radio transmission had been intercepted. It forbade anti-tank and tank fire by the frontline units in the bridgehead. This made it clear that they did not want to reveal their positions. Only in the case of a German attack on the bridgehead were they allowed to open fire. This order revealed two things. On one hand, they certainly had respect for our tanks. On the other hand, it was clear that Ivan had already positioned tanks in the bridgehead. That clearly indicated an intention to attack. Tanks could only be envisioned for an attack. They were completely unsuitable for defending in the marshy woods, which allowed no repositioning. It also didn't require any tremendous strategic talent to realize that the Russians would risk everything to roll up the bothersome German bridgehead at Narwa from the south. We had a lot of bad luck that evening. The rations had already been distributed, and we were chatting with our comrades from the company trains when Russian bomber formations approached. Generally, we didn't need to be especially worried right behind the front lines. But this time, when Ivan dropped his bombs noticeably short, a few of us crawled under the tanks. The rest disappeared as soon as possible. A lot of bombs even fell among the Russians. One fell directly behind one of my tanks, killing both crew members underneath it immediately from the concussion. The men sitting on the tanks were flung off and escaped with the shock of their lives. This unfortunate incident was another lesson for us to remain alert, even in relatively quiet periods. As we lay down in our bunker, still shaken by the event, the old saying about bad luck seldom travelling alone was confirmed shortly thereafter. We had barely lain down for an hour when a guard woke us. We heard a suspicious crackling and rustling. A few idiots from another unit, who didn't know anything about Russian heating, had fired up the stove in the house above us. Sparks flew, and the thatched roof immediately caught fire. Only with difficulty did we get out of the burning house, which then collapsed behind us. Ivan naturally fired at the good target. Once again, there was no such thing as a halfway peaceful night. The next day brought new surprises. We dispatched an enemy anti-tank gun first thing in the morning, after which the Russians didn't bring any more into position. Observation revealed that they had also brought artillery and heavy mortars close to the front, occasionally showering us with their attentiveness. In the evening, after our airborne duty NCO had once again given the march order to his bomber formations, we moved back. We found a small abandoned bunker in a patch of woods the size of a postage stamp. It was north of the trail and 1,000 meters west of the burned-down house. This became our nightly resting place from then on. The tanks were parked well camouflaged between the trees, and we were more or less satisfied. That same night, however, the sentry reported that the glow of a large fire could be seen in the direction of our infantry strongpoints, and that there was a lot of firing in progress. We immediately moved out and saw from afar that the farmhouse and both of the other strongpoints were burning brightly. The Russians had fired incendiary munitions at them to remove our last cover. I had been afraid of that for a long time. It always upset me that no trenches had been built, at least between the three strongpoints. Naturally, our soldiers had to get out of their bunkers during the fire, laying about in the terrain without cover. The losses would have been even greater during the day. The anticipated attack by the Russians did not happen. They probably only wanted to create a better line of sight. Fortunately for us, the houses in the Narwa sector had stone foundations. They did not burn and continued to offer protection. During the following night, they had to be covered with new beams. This situation meant that we were completely exposed to the world. We had to constantly observe the railway embankment to prevent a surprise from the Russians. For the time being, they didn't appear to have any desire to engage us in heavy firefights. That, too, was an indicator of their intention to carry out a large-scale attack. By early morning, we had already moved the severely wounded back to the Kinderheim. From then on, we became the jack-of-all-trades for the infantry, so that they wouldn't suffer even more casualties. Company strength had already shrunk to 10 to 12 men anyway. Almost every night, I went to the regimental command post behind the Kinderheim and asked the commander to have trenches dug in our sector during the night. Unfortunately, my proposals met with no success. In my opinion, it was obvious that the weakest point of our front was there. But Major Haase was always only worried about his 2 battalions in the boot. It had to be clear to him that further to the east we had to cover the sector boundary between 2 divisions. The enemy always liked to select such sectors for an attack. Once the houses had burned to the ground, the situation was practically hopeless for the infantry in case of a Russian attack toward the Rollbahn from the east Sack. From now on, these 3 houses would be referred to as the 3 ruins. I was finally able to arrange for a platoon of 4 well-camouflaged assault guns to be positioned with and east of the Kinderheim. 3 2cm quad flak guns also went into position 100 metres behind our farmhouse. Whenever an infantry radio broke down, we drove to the Kinderheim and picked up a replacement. We also risked picking up rations on moonlit nights, which could have been disastrous if a vehicle had been lost during such an action. But what was I supposed to do? I had to help the men as much as possible. They were grateful and sent us their regards long after we were employed in a completely different sector. We also had our worries about our loyal beerman. He appeared punctually every morning with hot coffee, even though he risked his neck with every trip. We simply didn't have the heart to tell him that we would have preferred rest to drinking coffee. This was because the Russians accompanied every trip by Beerman with wild fireworks. One morning he barely escaped. In the process he had 2 blowouts. He finally listened to my advice and stopped bringing the dangerous coffee. The infantry and flak crews were also happy. It always took a good half hour after Beerman's Kubel had shown up until Ivan quieted down and stopped his shooting. During one of those nights we had an interesting experience in our bunker. I myself was the centre of attraction. I must preface this by saying that we received an unwanted visit every night from a so-called lame duck or sewing machine. These were the names we gave to the Russian biplanes. They flew up and down behind the front, quite low, almost within reach. Besides hand grenades and mines, they also dropped small bombs. One could also call these machines the hot rod bombers, because the engine was always throttled before the pilot threw something out. He held the stick firmly between his knees when doing this. We were always ready for the drop if we were awake. One night, however, we were sound asleep when one of these strange birds showed up. By chance, one of its bombs fell directly on the corner of the bunker. It raised a great cloud of dirt, and 2 guys were slightly wounded by shrapnel. Everybody ran out of the bunker. They missed me outside and went back in. They found me lying there as if dead and began to undress me to see where I had been hit. Not until they were in the process of undressing me did I wake up. I noticed that I was covered in dirt and snow, completely unscratched. I had slept as soundly and as deeply as only a completely exhausted man can. The whole affair may sound improbable nowadays, but a doubting Thomas could easily be set straight by my Feldwebel Kircher. Even today he still likes to talk about this basically humorous incident. Frontline soldiers don't need a bed or pills to sleep like the dead. Living in a tank for weeks at a time wasn't something to shout about. One needs a little fantasy to imagine it in real terms. The confinement and the grim cold took their toll after a while. Our health was under considerable attack, even though we didn't want to admit it. The results showed up later, however. Moisture from our breath and the petroleum lamp settled onto the inner walls of the tank, freezing and forming a thick white coat of frost. If one of the crew nodded off and ended up with his hair on the wall of the tank, it would actually be frozen to it when he woke up. To a certain extent, we could only hunch down and shiver ourselves warm. The infantrymen in their positions hardly envied us at all. We could not move about in the tank and never had the opportunity to warm ourselves by a stove. I therefore wasn't surprised when one day I started carrying pleurisy with me, as the doctor later diagnosed. My left knee, which often lay against the wall of the tank, also had frostbitten spots. The deceptive calm before the storm continued until March 15th. We were hit by a mortar round on that day. We had always been able to avoid one up to that point through skillful evasive driving. I radioed to the company that the radiator was leaking. Fortunately, 2 vehicles had just come back from the repair shop and were ready to roll. They could relieve us the next morning. In the previous few days, the Russians had appeared with more and more heavy equipment from deep within the bridgehead. They didn't fire much, however, so we assumed they only wanted to zero in their guns. Up front, the infantry frequently made out the sounds of tracked vehicles, assuming it was tractors bringing the artillery pieces forward. At any rate, The striking quiet of the previous few days told us that nothing good was happening. Toward evening, Feldwebel Kirscher towed me back to our bunker. The next morning, the 16th, Oberfeldwebel Sveti arrived with 2 vehicles to relieve us. Before dawn, I went with him to the farmhouse and oriented him on the terrain. We then went in Kirscher's tow in the direction of home. We were extremely happy to finally have a few days of rest, to bathe, and to sleep to our heart's content. As we moved parallel to the front line along the West Sack, we passed the place where the 3 vehicles commanded by Oberfeldwebel Göring were. His position was better than ours in the East Sack. The crews had picked a cemetery as their overnight accommodations. The tanks were parked right against the cemetery wall, and the men slept in a grave vault, lined with bricks and reinforced above with beams. Viewed from a peacetime perspective, one would consider that blasphemous, but the law of war overrides the law of peace everywhere. The men were happy to be able to get into the frozen ground any way possible. Whoever had the misfortune to become a prisoner of the Russians later had the opportunity to see even more blasphemous things happen at cemeteries. Our forward support base, company commander and first sergeant were located in Sillemer at that time. The town is directly on the Baltic coast, about 25 kilometers west of Narwa and north of the Rollbahn. We first greeted all our comrades in the company. We hadn't seen them for a long time, and they scarcely recognized us with our beards. They had already heated the sauna for us, which was right on the beach. We really looked forward to the bath we hadn't had in such a long time. I then reported to the commander in his area. His tank was parked next to the house in front of the window as protection against artillery shrapnel. His greeting was not overwhelming. "Once again, you're not wearing a tie. It's no wonder that I continually have to dress down one of the men when you set such a poor example. Where is our respect supposed to come from if we let ourselves go like that? It should be noted that I always only wore a black scarf. I knew that von Schiller didn't like that. His words weren't spoken unfriendly, but they were completely serious. I replied, 'If the respect of my men depends completely on my tie, then there must be something wrong with me.' I had known von Schiller from my time as a recruit. He had immediately offered to use the familiar "du" with me after we arrived in Russia with the 502nd. He was my only superior in the battalion and never gave me an actual order. He knew that I always acted according to my own discretion when I was on my own anyway, and that was all the time when I was at the front. He never had a bad experience because of it. Our "du" relationship was also the reason that I constantly had to sit on the fence post. Whenever members of the company were present, I observed military decorum, and the "du" didn't exist anymore. I was always the man in the middle between the company and its commander, and had to mediate, sometimes for one side, sometimes for the other. Whoever claims he has never perceived an oppressive feeling of fear has certainly never been to the front. The prerequisite for bravery is fear, just as the fear of dying and the uncertainty of what follows this earthly existence are the prerequisites for the origin and existence of every religion. Real bravery is overcoming the fear of one's own death through the greater determination to be an example to one's soldiers and to support them. Probably none of us were free from fear. Before some operations, I did not feel the best, but as soon as the tank was rolling, I was distracted by so many things that I scarcely thought about the danger. After the first shot had been fired, our nerves quieted down on their own. Nothing went quite right when we were agitated. During the fighting, I could often transfer my outer calm to others through a short, humorous radio transmission. Von Schiller shouldn't have been surprised if his people didn't like him, since he didn't impress them in combat. As a consequence, no one could stand his arrogance. It probably functioned as some sort of self-defense for him. We knew each other too well to put something over on one another. I forgave him things that hardly any other friend would have been able to forgive. One couldn't demand the same tolerance from the men. After all, their employment at the front, to include the ultimate sacrifice, was demanded as a matter of course. Occasionally, his criticism was also completely justified. There was the embarrassing story concerning the use of code names on the radio. Von Schiller was briefing me on the situation in the bridgehead. He looked at me in an accusatory manner. These radio games in the clear have to come to a complete stop. You're not only endangering your own people with it. Wisely, I kept my silence. He really wasn't incorrect. I couldn't or simply didn't want to get used to the silly code names. During an operation, was I always supposed to radio, "Nightcap, this is Woodgrouse," and similar messages? Our men felt a whole lot better when they were addressed with their real names. I naturally made use of the code names when radioing the battalion and the supply point. With the men up front, however, I had addressed and continued to address them with their real names. Even more scorned was the unofficial radio traffic. We often heard a voice on the radio, "What's the word in smoking circles?" That meant that cigarettes had once again become scarce, and Otto Carius had to prove himself as a friend in need. It should be noted that I was well supplied from home. 10 to 15 small packages of cigarettes arrived with every mail call. My mother organised things on a grand scale for me. I immediately distributed the packages among the individual tanks. There was a short greeting on every one of the packages. These greetings were carefully packed away by the soldiers. Naturally, the Russians listened in. Because of the transmissions in the clear, they knew right away that wherever the Tigers showed up, there were always also the same men. The code names were changed every few days at the latest, whereas our names, of course, always remained the same. But Ivan would have noticed something anyway if we disappeared at Newell, for example, and reappeared at Narwa. For all appearances, we were a thorn in their side. One time, for instance, they announced via a loudspeaker unit in the East Sack at Lembitu that our infantry should hand me over to them. They would receive their choice of 30 soldiers in return. They demanded that our men finally defang the bloodhound who was continually forcing them to hold out. My comrades in the infantry only let the guy talk for a little while. They then shot the loudspeaker to pieces when it got to be too much for them. They seemed to have an unfortunate liking for this bloodhound. Ivan continued his loudspeaker activities without flinching, which proved the great respect he had for our battalion. After I was wounded at Dienerberg, the Russians announced over the radio that I had been killed. The Soviet officer who delivered the lost map board with my name on it to prove his success was decorated. My first sergeant wrote me this news to cheer me up while I was in the hospital. It's well known, after all, that those given up for dead often manage to live the longest. Naturally, we enjoyed our involuntary impromptu vacation in the support base. The sauna had let us become human again, and we felt like newborn babes. As a result of this opportunity, I also sweated out my pleurisy and was again healthy to the core. We didn't have any idea, however, how short our rest would be. At the front, you were wont to make use of the good times and not think about later and for how long. We had scarcely gotten used to the nice warm room when the report came in from WWII that the radiator of his Tiger was also leaking. He also said the second vehicle had been damaged in the running gear. Ivan was probably quite satisfied in having damaged 3 of our vehicles. He was known to have something against Tigers. For the time being, Feldwebel remained in the village. In the event of action, he could at least support the infantry with fire. I went to my maintenance people to see how far the work on my radiator had progressed. There was no doubt in my mind that we had goofed off long enough. The work performed by the men in the maintenance section cannot be described using standard terms. Nowadays, one would characterize their physical performance as humanly impossible. This self-sacrificing activity behind the front could not be brought about by orders. Instead, it presupposed an inner conviction and the will to help the combat troops by all means available. They wanted to have the damaged vehicles rolling to the front again as soon as possible. Oberfeldwebel del Zeit, the leader of the maintenance section, was anything but easy to get along with. His good side was covered by a very rough exterior. He often chewed butt so thoroughly that his men barely fit in their uniforms afterward. By the same token, he also treated his superiors with so little respect that we didn't have to have a picture painted for us to imagine what would happen to his people if they had done the same thing to him. But since everyone knew him, neither the gentlemen from above nor the men from below thought the worse of him. Del Zeit was a first-class professional, and he used all his abilities to get a defective vehicle in shape again. he was also a good comrade who never left his people in the lurch. The well-being of his platoon took precedence over everything else. They often worked day and night during operations. The men of the maintenance sections certainly didn't lag behind the soldiers at the front in toughness. If Delzite promised a vehicle at a certain time, one could depend on him. Those are the type of men that one needs at the front. What did it really matter that someone had a somewhat rough nature? Smooth-talking and constantly obliging types are out of place wherever men have to prove themselves. Their time to shine has always come after the catastrophes. On March 16, 1944, our friend Delzite had once again worked in an exacting and dependable manner. I discovered during my visit to the maintenance section's bunker that my tank would be finished at midnight. Nothing therefore stood in the way of relieving the others. Our pass had lasted exactly 24 hours, but we had used it well. I also brought the news to Kirsch's crew that they didn't need to unpack their stuff completely. Instead, they were to get everything ready and lay down in order to be able to sleep comfortably for a few hours. In the meantime, the remaining 2 companies and the battalion staff had been directed to the area around Pleskau. We remained by ourselves in the Narwa position. It thus came to pass that I never saw Major Gide again. He had been awarded the Knight's Cross on March 15th and was then transferred to the Non-Commissioned Officer Academy at Eisenach as its commander. That meant an award and the climbing of a few more steps up the career ladder, but his departure certainly wasn't easy for him. We also didn't like to see him depart because we had gotten along with him so magnificently. The comrades who were there when both the Knight's Cross and the departure were celebrated at the same time later told me how difficult the separation from the 502nd had been for Gide. He could not hide his tears when each of the men shook his hand. After the war, I discovered in a roundabout fashion that the Russians had saddled him with a so-called war crimes trial in Eisenach. I have never been able to discover the verdict. Unfortunately, every trace of him is also missing. Perhaps we will get the happy news someday, possibly caused by this book, that Gide is still living and we will be able to see him again. In the evening, I sat together with von Schiller for a long time with a good bottle of whiskey. He couldn't understand why I wanted to lay down a bit before my departure. He wasn't exactly wrong when he said that I would have ample opportunity to rest up at the front, despite the uncomfortable position. Of course, Ivan also had something to contribute concerning that. We knew only too well that the deceptive calm would soon come to an end. I thus took leave of my company commander and lay down. We wanted to get started at 4 a.m. That way our comrades could be relieved before the break of day and get their defective vehicle out of sight of the Russians. I instructed the sentry to wake me in time. Unfortunately, I hadn't counted on his consideration. When Kirscher himself finally came for me around 5 o'clock, I was still lying in a deep sleep. The sentry resolutely claimed that he had awakened me according to orders. I had even given a response, but I didn't want to know about any of that. I also had a hangover that didn't let me look forward to duty. To add insult to injury, I yelled at the innocent guard and ran to my vehicle. Everyone was already waiting for me there. It was high time. We arrived at Zweti's location shortly after 7. He was able to disappear just before daybreak. The contact with the infantry was completely in order, and the battalion commander told me that the front was quiet. I therefore went back to sleep right away. If we were needed, we were always immediately available. It was also clear to the men up front that it was quieter in their positions whenever we weren't with them. That only gave Ivan occasion to start his usual wild shooting, and another tank might have been lost. Ivan attacks. Shortly after daybreak, I was awakened more abruptly than I would have liked. The alarm clock this time was the Russians. Their methods were extremely disagreeable. Out of the blue, they laid down a barrage that left nothing to the imagination. It covered the entire front of our bridgehead. Only Ivan could lay down a barrage like that. Even the Americans, whom I got to know later on in the West, couldn't compete with them. The Russians shot with every available weapon, from light mortars all the way up to heavy artillery. They showed us that they had been doing everything but sleeping in the previous few weeks. The entire 51st Infantry Division sector was covered with such a barrage that we thought all hell had broken loose. We were right in the middle of it, and it was completely impossible for us to get to our tanks from the bunker. Whenever we got ready to dash after one salvo hit, the whistling sound of the next one forced us back to the bunker entrance. Due to the intensity of the fire, it was not possible to tell where the main point of the attack was. After all, the fact that the Russians were attacking was no longer a secret. Naturally, the line to the infantry was broken after the fire had been initiated. Everything was up in the air. We assumed that the Russians were attacking in our sector at Lembitu, but we also had to count on the possibility of the enemy infantry rounding us up before we even got to our tanks. The Russians shifted their fire farther north after a good half hour, an eternity for us. It was then high time that we jumped into our tanks. The Russian attack was obviously in full swing. The skies above us also became alive. Close air support, which hadn't appeared at all in the previous weeks, raced over us. They raced so close past us that we got the impression they wanted to take our hats with them. They thundered about wildly in the area and dropped smoke bombs north of our position, so that the artillery observers were blinded. From all appearances, Ivan had something quite big planned. He apparently wanted to reach the coast that day to cut off our bridgehead in front of Narwa from the rear. This would have encircled elements of the SS Panzer Corps, the Feldherrnhalle Division, and Wengler's infantry. The important question for us was whether we were inside or outside the pocket. In the meantime, the situation had become extremely critical. Shortly before 10 o'clock, a few ground troops came running past me heading west. Then came a 37mm flak gun with a 12-ton prime mover. After that came another 20 to 30 men, all without weapons. All this occurred during the barrage, which continued unabated. Although we were only about 30 meters in the woods, they didn't pay any attention to us at all. I had to run to them to find out that all 3 strongpoints had been evacuated. One of the assault guns east of the Kinderheim was burning, and the other had driven off. The Russians were already heading toward the Rollbahn with tanks and infantry. There was no more time to be lost. It was clear that they were pushing north with strong forces in order to roll up our bridgehead at Narwa. I immediately moved quickly to the vicinity of the farmhouse. Kersher was right behind me, and I had him fan out to the left. He was supposed to concentrate on what was happening on the open plain. The Russians were moving on it in regimental strength north of our strongpoints. 5 T-34S were already closing at full speed on the Rollbahn. A 6th Russian tank had almost reached the Kinderheim before we caught sight of it. But first, I directed my attention to the 5 AT guns on the railway embankment that were threatening our flank. They were the most dangerous opponents at that moment. I was soon finished with them, but not before I had taken a few hits in the running gear. Fortunately, none of them caused serious damage. While my gunner, Unteroffizier Kramer, was shooting it out with the Russian anti-tank guns, I looked to the left at just the right time. I discovered the T-34 that had turned around when we showed up and was heading almost dead on toward Kersher. The situation had reached critical mass. It was literally a question of seconds. We were lucky that the Russians had buttoned up like they always did and could not size up the terrain fast enough. Kersher hadn't noticed the tank either because it was practically coming from the rear. It was racing past him, barely 30 meters away. I was able to notify Kersher just in time. "Hey, Kersher, a T-34 right behind you. Watch out!" Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Kersher took care of the Russians with a direct hit. They careened into a bomb crater and didn't come out. We had a good reason to catch our breath. If Ivan had kept his nerves and fired, both of us probably would have been finished. They probably also didn't have a clue as to who knocked them out and from where. All of the Soviet tanks had to cross the railroad crossing in a row before they could deploy properly. Naturally, this maneuver delayed their attack considerably. We had arrived a few minutes too early for them. We were therefore unable to catch the rest of the tanks that were driving on the far side of the railway embankment. Ivan immediately pulled back into the protectiveness of the marshy woods when we began to mop up among them. For the most part, his infantry was also able to withdraw while we were occupied with the anti-tank guns and the tanks. Naturally, our strongpoints had been completely abandoned. There weren't any German infantrymen to be seen in the entire sector between Lembitu and the point where the railway embankment disappeared in the woods. Only the machine gun on the right flank of the Feldherrnhalle division started firing again in the late afternoon. We soon reached our old front lines at the ruins, where we found ourselves all alone on the plain. My report that the strongpoints had been evacuated by our infantry was somehow denied by division. Later in the afternoon, I finally decided to drive to the Kinderheim myself. I wanted to have at least a few people rounded up in order to occupy the strongpoints that we had kept clear of the enemy. By the time these men finally arrived, however, the Russians had already taken both forward ruins under the cover of darkness. All in all, we had all sorts of frustration that day with the rearward command posts. In the meantime, after a half-hour barrage in the early afternoon, the Russians once again attacked our sector using armour support. We also repulsed this attack and were able to knock out another 5 T-34S and a KVI. Knocked-out tanks are occasionally odious and malicious things. We had to duck our heads at one point when a few of the tanks exploded and all sorts of metal parts flew through the air. What made me mad was the fact that our artillery could not be convinced to fire protective barrages. It should be noted that the observers had been lost, and division had the erroneous impression that the ruins were occupied. As a result, our own people would have been in the area of the barrage. An hour and a half later, the Russians were once again staging for an attack with strong forces at the railway embankment. I wasn't able to guarantee that I could repulse a third attack with my remaining ammunition. In the meantime, I had received a third tank and requested my company commander to also appear with his vehicle. He radioed a number of times that he was directly behind me in the wood line. I never did catch a glimpse of him, however, and I later discovered that his tank had never headed toward us at all. Once again, I had all sorts of reasons to be angry at my commander. But I didn't say anything because I was happy that von Schiller was at least able to get the artillery to finally initiate our protective fire. It was laid so well that the Russian attack position was completely destroyed. Exactly 1 hour later, Ivan assembled in battalion strength and with armour support for another attack. He wanted to take our strongpoints at all costs. He didn't obtain his objective and lost another 3 T-34S. It was after this last unsuccessful attack of the Russians that I left 2 Tigers at the ruins, and personally drove to the regimental command post at the Kinderheim to report on the actual situation. It should be noted that they were still maintaining the hypothesis that the ruins were occupied by our infantry. It was through me that the regimental commander first discovered the real situation. He then gathered up a few people from his staff. Because that took a while, I had to displace about 200 metres from the ruins during darkness in order to have a field of fire and be safe against tank killer teams. Only 1 Tiger stayed back at the farmhouse. The farmhouse was also kept clear of the enemy until the 10 men who had been picked arrived and occupied it. Another 25 men formed a line along a trail behind us. The Russians didn't attempt any new attacks during the night, but were able to occupy the ruins without resistance. 2 hours before midnight, we drove back to fetch supplies. Less than 10 minutes after we had arrived at the bunker, both trucks of the company trains showed up. They had been on call at the supply point in Sillamar since the early afternoon. I had arranged a point on the Rollbahn where they were supposed to meet me in case it had been necessary to resupply us with ammunition during the day. But because Feldwebel Gruber had made it through to us with a third tank, our supplies held out and we were able to wait out the darkness. Hauptfeldwebel Sepp Rieger, the first sergeant, had also come up front with the resupply group to help celebrate the day. He wouldn't think of not congratulating us personally on our defensive success. Rieger was a splendid fellow, the likes of which one seldom sees. I believe it would have been hard to find a dozen first sergeants of his calibre in the entire Wehrmacht, which doesn't mean to say that the bulk of the first sergeants were bad. Men like Rieger were an exception, however. He was an example to everyone, both as a soldier and as a person. He had a well-rounded personality, knowledgeable without being pedantic, thrifty without the slightest tendency towards stinginess. He had earned an Iron Cross First Class as a tank commander and platoon leader in the line. He also knew that despite all sense of justice, it was impossible to do right by everyone. Occasionally there were soldiers who complained because Riga was very strict in watching out for the equipment, but he was also responsible for it and knew how scarce everything was. I also never heard of him taking one more cigarette or bottle of schnapps from the canteen than was coming to him. For him, the combat troops came first. Then came the maintenance staff, followed by resupply and finally the trains. He was dear to the heart of everyone in the company, the superiors as well as the subordinates. Riga was an exemplary comrade. As a superior, he knew how to bring about respect without yelling. Everyone revered him and recognized his sense of fairness. That was our Sepp Riga. Certainly no one who ever had the good fortune to be allowed to serve under him has ever forgotten him. We then hauled gasoline and munitions to the tanks to stow it away. 100 rounds and 200 litres of gasoline were needed for each Tiger. One can well imagine how we first had our work cut out for us before we could think about the warm meal. But then we switched over to feeding and war stories. Riga told us how they had experienced our day in Silema. The company commander had ordered a line run from the receiver on his Tiger outside the window to the loudspeaker on the field radio. They were thus able to listen in on our radio traffic. For every kill that was announced, Riga treated his men to a schnapps. And there was one thing that the men could not understand, however, and that was why the commander hadn't taken off for us, even though I had urgently requested him to do so many times. They also thought badly of him for not initially being able to get the artillery support for us. That was because he didn't talk to the responsible party in person but on the telephone. Not until toward evening, when I reported that the position could not be held anymore, did he finally drive to Kor in his Kubel to insist on the final protective barrage. It was also initiated a half-hour later. The behaviour of the commander had the men in an uproar. I had to make all sorts of effort to calm them down. Of course, I was also disappointed by von Schiller. I told the men, however, that we didn't need to get excited after the fact. After all, we had taken care of the matter all by ourselves, and the final protective barrage had arrived in the nick of time. Toward midnight, we drove back to the ruins to give our infantry some moral support. I went to the Kinderheim, where I spoke to the regimental commander about the plans for the next day. We agreed to retake the ruins at the morning twilight. The attempt had to be made in any case, so that the Russians couldn't threaten us on our side of the railway embankment from the two sets of ruins. That could make the entire situation even more precarious. For our planned counterattack, we pulled out an additional 16 men from our already meagre strength. Around 5 o'clock, we assembled for the attack in Tirtsu, a small spot on the map between the Kinderheim and Lembitu. Feldwebel Kirscher and I each had 8 men assigned to us. The attack began punctually at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still completely dark, of course. Feldwebel Gruber had the mission of pinning down the Russians during our assault. First, we fired at the western ruin from point-blank range using all 3 tanks. We then drove right up to it, and my 8 men occupied it. The operation was completely successful, and we only had 1 wounded man to complain about. In contrast, the attack against the eastern ruin near the railway crossing was more difficult. It appeared to be of great importance to Ivan. In fact, he had set up 5 anti-tank guns, 2 artillery pieces, and a 47mm anti-aircraft gun during the night. We had to duke it out with them for a while. It should be noted that that was typical for the Russians. If they sat anywhere for just a few hours, especially at night, they hauled up materiel like ants and dug into the ground like gophers. Even though we had constantly experienced that, we never could figure out how they actually did it. Despite all our efforts, we were not successful in regaining the second strongpoint. During our firefight, Ivan started a counterattack with 2 T-34S and a small infantry unit. We were able to beat them back, and their tanks were knocked out in the process. Shortly thereafter, heavy mortar and artillery fire of extremely heavy caliber began to arrive. We had 2 killed and 2 wounded. It was not possible for the remaining 4 to take the strongpoint, let alone hold it. Unfortunately, the leader of the infantry, a lieutenant from the staff, was killed when he assaulted the ruins, shouting, "Hurrah!" The Russians continued to fire with an MG that we weren't able to silence. They couldn't afford to give up their position on our side of the railway embankment under any conditions. Running back would have been even more hopeless than holding out, since they then would have been without cover in our fields of fire. For the time being, we had to recover our wounded. Using both Tigers, we approached as close as possible so that we could load the wounded under the cover of the vehicles without falling victim to the machine gun fire. The Russians had probably had 30 to 40 men killed, yet the contested ruins continued to remain in enemy hands for the next few days. Shortly after noon, following a 15-minute barrage, the Russians tried to win back the strongpoint and the farmhouse. They attacked in company strength using armour support. They were beaten back with heavy casualties and lost a T-34 and a T-60. They finally appeared to have had enough for that day. We remained undisturbed until the next morning. When we returned to our bunker in the evening, the supply vehicles had already arrived. Once again there were problems with our commander. Our people were already extremely upset with him. I had radioed a request for a Kibel so I could drive to the 61st Infantry Division command post during the night. I also wanted to spare myself having to go to the regimental command post on foot. Each time that meant a distance of 8 kilometers back and forth across country. To avoid the attention of the Russians, I didn't want to go with the tank. Besides, my crew deserved some rest whenever possible. The Kibel I requested did not show up, however. Biermann reported that the company commander apparently didn't have one available. Not until a get-together after the war did I discover from one of the soldiers assigned to the orderly room that he and von Schiller had visited a female acquaintance on several evenings. She had come back from Narwa with them. So that was the reason he needed the Kibel. Had I known that back then, I too would have finally blown my top. This knowledge was kept from me during the entire war, however, so as not to get me too worked up. It also caused consternation among my men when the 2nd Company of the 502nd, under the leadership of Oberleutnant von Schiller, was mentioned in the Wehrmacht Daily Bulletin. After all, our commander had contributed nothing to our success. This time it was difficult to calm the men down. I made it clear to them that the entire company had been honoured in this fashion. Otherwise, only one platoon could have been mentioned. In the final analysis, the entire company had participated in our success. It was good I didn't yet know anything about the unbelievable use of the Kibel for joyrides. Otherwise, I certainly wouldn't have made any effort to calm down my men. It should be noted that we were rewarded in another manner, by a special mention in the Corps Order of the day, which was distributed to all the units of the Corps and read aloud. Only our tanks were mentioned in this order. It was stressed that through action on our own initiative we had stopped the Russian penetration to the coast and prevented the subsequent cutting off of all the units east of the Kinderheim. In addition, we had held the recaptured front line for the entire day without infantry support. Ivan didn't grant us any rest. He wanted to roll up or encircle the bridgehead at Narwa at all costs. Around noon on March 19th, the enemy attacked west from the East Sack after artillery and mortar preparation. Their objective was to cut off the southern portion of the boot, which we had held up to that point. They aimed to link the East Sack with the West Sack to create better jumping-off positions for further attacks. We knocked out 6 T-34S and a T-60 and destroyed a 76.2 mm AT gun. Despite this, the Russians successfully penetrated our front lines. Before our infantry could start the counterattack, we had to intervene at another location. A strongpoint north of the railway embankment reported that 4 Russian assault guns had set up on the far side of the railway crossing in a small patch of woods. Additionally, 2 Russian tanks had approached to the right of the railway crossing. Feldwebel Kirscher and I arrived just in time, as panic had already begun to spread among our infantry. With no anti-tank weapons available besides our Tigers, we were able to knock out the enemy tanks before they could attack and effectively support our infantry's counterattack to the south from point 39.9, along the route from the Kinderheim to the boot sole. The marshy terrain posed significant challenges. We couldn't drive off the road. We relied on our firepower to help our infantry hold the enemy at bay. After 3 hours, the enemy was dislodged, and our infantry regained their old positions. One officer deserves special mention. Major Haase stormed the Russian positions with remarkable courage, leading his battalion. This type of action reminded me of the stories my father told me about officers in World War I charging ahead of their men with drawn swords. During this attack, we destroyed 2 more T-34S. However, the Russians weren't deterred. By dawn the next day, they attacked at Lembaitu with company-sized strength, but were pushed back after an hour of struggle. A subsequent attack around noon met the same fate, resulting in 2 more tanks and a 45mm anti-tank gun lost by the Russians. They continued their efforts, launching another assault at 3 in the morning. We could only fire blindly in the darkness, and Ivan managed to take the ruins in the middle. Learning from our previous rebuff, I executed a counterattack with 10 infantrymen. 2 hours later, we had reclaimed the ruins. Despite our rapid response, the Russians had already positioned 2 76.2 mm AT guns, causing us significant trouble. The reconquered ruins were crucial. Losing them would have meant the farmhouse would soon follow, potentially leading to a collapse of our entire defensive front. The Russians renewed their attack 2 hours later. Ultimately, we had to evacuate the ruins after losing 4 infantrymen, including the leader of the strongpoint. The remaining 6 sought shelter in the farmhouse. We then positioned our 3 tanks around the farmhouse, determined to hold it at all costs. With the infantry's radio damaged, I sent Feldwebel Gruber to the regimental command post to fetch replacements, as it was impossible for the infantrymen to return on foot. The Russians played cat and mouse with us, always attacking where we weren't, keeping us on our toes. In the afternoon, Feldwebel Kirscher knocked out another 2 Russian tanks at point 33.7. Before nightfall, we launched a new counterattack against the middle ruins, securing them half an hour later. This would be our final attack before we focused on the east sack later, and established a stronger front line further south as part of Operation Strachwitz. The heavy casualties suffered by the Russians forced them to take a breather, largely due to our magnificent infantry, who performed exceptionally under pressure. After the situation stabilized, I set up my Tigers on the plain to cover the railway crossing. It was far from enjoyable. The Russians' artillery and mortar fire forced us to constantly change positions, leaving us exposed. They observed our every movement, especially from the eastern ruins on our side of the railway embankment. As always, I ordered that no tanks were allowed to back up without radio directions from a neighbouring vehicle. A Tiger commander couldn't see directly behind his tank and risked getting stuck while reversing. This was particularly true in muddy or snowy conditions, where even slight turning movements could cause a neighbouring tank to get stuck. Despite our precautions, a serious mishap occurred. Under fire, Feldwebel Gruber suddenly reversed and drove straight into a bomb crater. He hadn't set his radio correctly and didn't see my signals, so I couldn't prevent him from disappearing into the crater. Only the muzzle brake of his cannon was visible. He eventually regained radio contact, cursing his bad luck. Unfortunately, none of his crew could exit the tank because the Russians had seen everything and fired furiously at Gruber's position. It was a dire situation, and I dreaded the thought of recovering the tank under such circumstances. My own Tiger was also out of commission due to clutch damage, complicating matters further. Fortunately, Zweti arrived in his freshly repaired tank and, alongside Kirscher, managed to recover Gruber and his crew. However, the Russians began firing wildly again at the 2 tanks, aware of our recovery attempt. One of their delayed fuse 15 Seelem mortar rounds struck one of our tanks, penetrating the radio operator's hatch and injuring a young soldier, his first operation, barely 18 years old. In our bunker we bandaged him, but the sight was harrowing. He had suffered devastating injuries to his legs, and his incoherent babbling about his mother shook me to the core. I comforted him as best as I could and ensured he was promptly evacuated to the field hospital. I was relieved to learn later that he survived, though he had to have his left lower leg amputated. On March 22nd, the Russians made one last attempt to take point 33.9 in the boot, but they were repelled, losing 2 more tanks in the process. After this, there was finally quiet in the East Sack. Between March 17th and 22, we had knocked out 38 Russian tanks, 4 assault guns, and 17 artillery pieces during the heavy defensive fighting, leaving us reasonably satisfied with our efforts.